So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio.
I was looking at this tweet the other day from the United Nations, and they put this slogan up there, help create a more equal world. And I'm so sick and tired of these slogans about equality. I was even reading an article, I think it was from the National Geographic this morning, and it was talking about how there are some species of animals that are more important than the others. And instead of saying like, hey, this species is more important, look at how it's contributing to the ecosystem, which it did say, it was saying some species are more equal than others. How can you be more equal than others? Just the equality language is everywhere, whether it's talking about human persons and the value of the woman and her right to choose versus the value of the child living its life, whether it has to do with love and that all love is equal and the same. These slogans get confusing, but the United Nations is outright ridiculous, because if you read this tweet, they were giving an example of kind of this all-inclusive, gender-neutral language. And just to name a few of them, they were talking about how you should use, for example, instead of landlord, you should say owner. Now, this one was interesting because someone wrote back in a tweet and they gave an example, such as, okay, so you're going to say that Dave is my owner rather than Dave is my landlord? It just doesn't make sense. Or, for example, instead of saying boyfriend or girlfriend, you now need to refer to your partner. Now, I have to say, even the church has gotten this wrong sometimes in our quote-unquote pastoral approach, because when I was doing marriage prep, a lot of the church officials and some of our retreats that we were going on, not to name any particular retreats, I think a lot of you know the horror and mess that unfortunately some of our marriage prep retreats have been. I know there are great marriage prep retreats out there, but I had a not so great experience, and I know many others did. But the whole day they kept talking about referring to your partner or your beloved, because they didn't want to say boyfriend, girlfriend, future spouse, bride, groom. And I thought, what are we doing? What's the point here? Here are some other ones that I found interesting. So you can no longer refer to a maiden name, but it should be a family name. I'm sorry, but people aren't going to know what the heck you're talking about if you put that on a legal document, okay? And the other one is that instead of saying husband and wife, you really should be using words such as spouse now. So, I mean, this gender-neutral chaos, I really do kind of laugh at it sometimes, but it's not really a joking matter, because people actually think that this is really important to prove that men and women are equal, all lifestyles are equal and okay and approved. And joining me just a little bit later today is Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparo. He joins me every Wednesday here on Trending, and here's part of the reason why I really appreciate his take. He's someone who not only follows what the Catholic Church teaches, not only practices marriage and family therapy, not only works as a youth minister, talk about someone who's really invested in the church and helping people, but he himself has experienced same-sex attraction. And he's one of the first people to call out the confusion and ambiguity that this UN-proposed language pushes on other people. Now, it's really interesting because some of you may remember back in the middle of 2019, Dr. Leanna Wen, who was the head for a short period of time of Planned Parenthood, left. Now, insiders at Planned Parenthood said that part of the reason why she left was actually over this gender-neutral language. It wasn't the main reason, but she was pushing back against the administration that was really claiming that we had to use language such as pregnant persons instead of pregnant women. And props to Dr. Leanna Wen, who is a medical doctor and who was not willing to lie in this circumstance about the body from what I see. Now, this is actually really interesting because if you followed any of the politics in Hungary over the last couple of years, they have seen their culture radically transformed from being very anti-life, pro-divorce and really broken families, broken homes, and ended lives far too soon. Now, they've been implementing very pro-family legislation to help boost not just the family, but to boost the family from the perspective that the family is the heartbeat of society. Now, other countries are doing the same thing. For example, Italy last year started to propose laws and bills such as to help people to buy a home. Because, I mean, just one example of this, we're hearing about movements in Italy where a church, St. Rita's Church, is helping young women to find a wedding dress because some young people just aren't getting married because it's so expensive. And so instead of living in a culture that is kind of providing incentives for being single moms and not married, we want to support a culture that is engaging in society as the heartbeat of the family, providing a mother and a father to children within the home. Now, coming back to this Hungary issue, they've just recently banned, get this, they've banned altering birth certificates. Now, you may say, well, why would birth certificates be banned? Well, did you know that that's actually being done in some states here in the United States? Birth certificates are actually being altered if someone suddenly decides that they want to identify with a sex or gender other than what they were born with. Now, so what's happened is Hungary has said, no, you have to keep your birth sex recorded on your birth certificate. It seems pretty logical. Now, here are two reasons why I would argue this is incredibly logical. One, from a healthcare perspective, we need to receive healthcare according to the truth and reality of our bodies. And I hadn't thought about this before now, but what if it was recorded on someone's personal identification that they were a man when really they're a woman? And the patient comes in and the doctor just starts to treat this female as if she's really a male. But in reality, our bodies actually function differently. And if the doctor just treats a real biological female as if she's a male, that could actually do serious harm to her body potentially. And not only that, it could delay and cause confusion during treatment, therefore delaying the doctor from not only properly caring for and bringing health and maybe even helping to save the life of that patient, but also distracting the doctor from being able to move on to the next patient who needs and deserves dire health care. And so that's just one logical reason for why we should keep the real biological birth sex on our birth certificate and say driver's license. And second, and this is really important, it's what is real. It's what is true. And I know that's a simple argument, but at a certain point, we have to understand that in an age where depression, anxiety, suicide, mental illness is such a serious issue, maybe we need to reconsider why young people are struggling in their self-identity and self-esteem. Maybe it's because we've caused a lot of confusion with this gender-neutral language that doesn't tell the truth about the body as male and female. So the argument at the end of the day, whether you're reading a tweet from the United Nations about total bogus language that is gender neutral, or if you're hearing about Hungary banning any use of a false sex on your records for your birth certificate, we need to see that this is based in reality. And when people try to say, well, you're forcing people to live in a particular way, actually, the Hungarian government just commented and said, actually, this is just about paperwork. Essentially, people are still free to think and live as they wish. We're just trying to keep proper documentation in these circumstances. So it's just food for thought when approaching this issue. It has nothing to do with hating anyone. It has nothing to do with having animosity or homophobia or transphobia. It's about basing our responses to these confusing topics in reality and not just laughing them off, because I was tempted to just laugh off the ridiculous tweet from the United Nations. But then we have to remember that the United Nations is a major international organization that is influencing the world and is helping to influence various states, countries and all sorts of government specifically on issues that actually matter for the pursuit of happiness in our culture. Joining me in just a second is Michael Gasparo. Now, I am really fascinated every time I get to talk to Michael because he has a very truthful and a very loving response to some of the most important topics in our culture. And so we're going to be talking to him about this whole issue of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. And then just in a little bit, we'll also be talking about kind of the struggle that is so common in the culture, whether it's stay-at-home order or quarantine time, or whether it's the holidays, or just living day-to-day life, or when you end up going to a wedding. And that is maybe you're feeling extremely alone right now and single during this point in your life. Maybe that feeling is exasperated right now because of the quarantine and isolation. We're going to be talking about some tools that we can use to better engage our hearts, our souls, our bodies in the truth of what we are created for, despite feeling kind of that status of single, so that it doesn't begin to define who we are and what's going on, but it begins to allow us the freedom to live in a way that actually brings us happiness. Because sometimes it's so easy to let that singleness, seem to define every action, rather than allowing who you are to just continue to be a contribution to the culture. You're listening to Trending with Timmery. Joining me now is Associate Marriage and Family Therapist, Michael Gasparo. Michael, how you doing?
Doing well. How are you, Timmery?
I'm doing great. Thanks for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you about this topic. Now, for those who aren't familiar with you, you're a marriage and family therapist. You work in the Diocese of Los Angeles as well as a youth minister. And you also have shared, and we'll have to have you share your testimony again here soon, your own experience in having experienced same-sex attraction. Could you share briefly that experience so people understand where you're coming from when we talk about this International Day of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to realize is that my own experience is one of a complicated history of dealing with some same-sex attraction issues that led me to understanding the church's teachings being a pathway to freedom in my life. And because of that, I found that over time, even though I'm far from perfect and I've been very vocal about my struggles over the years, especially when I talk about this issue publicly, I found that the closer I'm living in line with God's teaching about sexuality through the Catholic Church's teachings on faith and morals, the more freedom, the more joy, and the more peace I have in my life. And that's led me to being passionate to helping exclaim and proclaim the goodness and the truth of the Church's teachings on homosexuality.
And if you don't mind coming up here maybe in the next week or so, I'd like you to share more of your testimony so listeners understand where you're coming from when you share about so much of this, because that barely scratches the surface, but it helps people to understand. A lot of people say, well, you Catholics, don't get it. You don't have family members. You don't have friends who are living this out. Actually, that's a lie. I grew up in the world of dancing. I know you grew up in the arts as well, and I was surrounded by friends who experienced same-sex attraction. I was surrounded by multiple family members who have also experienced same-sex attraction and lived out these lifestyles at various points in their life. And so these are people who I've had to get along with, who have been my friends, family members, friends and family at dinners, holiday parties, religious gatherings. It's not like we're totally divorced from having to actually deal with the practicality of this issue day in and day out. And so I have to tell you, Michael, when people kind of bring up these days such as May 17th, which apparently was International Day against homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, I find it fascinating that they always feel like they have to attack the Catholic Church's kind of understanding about same-sex attraction, and that the Catholic Church is hateful and treats this community as if they're just gross and sinful, and that's all they are. But that's not really what the Church believes, teaches, or even lives out if it's actually living the Church's teaching.
Yeah, and I think it's also important for your listeners to remember that not only do people like me have a story of an experience like this, of dealing with same-sex attraction in my own life, but we also have family members and friends who have similar experiences. And as you said, knowing people and loving people with this issue is not the same thing as approving of same-sex sexual acts, behaviors, identity, etc. So what we want to encourage people to remember is that all the things that we're sharing through either our lived experience or our opinions and beliefs based on the Catholic Church's teachings are rooted in love. And one thing we can strive to do, Timmery, as Catholics who are striving to share the gospel with truth and with love, is to speak about this in a loving way. And one thing that does happen sometimes that we can accept as a community that we need to do better is we can sometimes speak about this issue in a way that singles people out to an unfair level, or even maybe minimizes them based on their experience. So are they really your brother if they have this struggle? Did I always feel included or loved by my brothers in Christ at the high school youth group? No, because there was maybe jokes made at the expense of people who have this struggle, etc. So we can do better as a body of believers and still hold true to the deep and real teachings of the Catholic Church around homosexuality.
And I have to say, Michael, this is a topic that I actually am very sensitive toward, in the sense that some of my dearest friends were very much so picked on in high school because people assumed that they were gay. And at the time, they did not kind of come out with that sort of identity, but years later had. And I mean, we're talking about people who were literally bullied, physically harmed. And I mean, we're not just talking about things like being trash canned, that happened, but other things much worse as well. And I remember, growing up in a small town, going to bat and fighting people verbally who just felt like they could bully others whose lifestyles they disagree with. So the fact that transphobia, homophobia, and all these things are out there, I admit, but you can't single out the Catholic Church or individuals who sometimes, even people I respect, do a really poor job at articulating what the Church actually believes about this experience that is common for some people in the culture.
One thing that's important to keep in mind, too, is that we have to define our terms. And what makes something a phobia? It's an irrational fear of something. And if you're saying someone's transphobic or homophobic, you're saying they're irrationally afraid of people who have same-sex tendencies or same-sex erotic arousal, or they're irrationally afraid of people who have gender identity issues. And that is not the same thing as having concerns over people's lifestyle or their choices to try to live as the opposite sex in some kind of delusional way, whether it be through surgical intervention or otherwise. So it's a bit unfair on behalf of Catholics who get labeled these phobic terms for simply holding a belief that is different regarding the moral value of someone's lifestyle. And that's what I think I hear you articulating as well, is that we have to stand up for our right to have a different opinion and not be considered phobic because of it.
You're listening to Trending with Timmery. That is Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparo. You can find him and his work at healingandpeace.com, healingandpeace.com. Michael, I want to touch on this from a little bit different of a perspective as well, as we're talking about, people who, people criticize the Catholic Church for being obsessed about sex and being opposed to same-sex marriage, and say, you just really need to get with the times, allow people to love and live and, enjoy their life. But I have to share with you a perspective that I have that I think really relates these issues and might shine it in a little bit different of a light. So for those who don't know, I worked for a number of years in the crisis pregnancy centers and have spent countless years sidewalk counseling in front of the abortion clinic. And what I saw at the heart of women who were possibly considering having an abortion, or some who did, were women who experience extremely broken sexuality, very broken understanding of love. And as the years went on, especially as we kind of got maybe a little more toward 2010 and later, we started to see this ambiguity that entered in with regard to sexuality, where bisexuality was more common among the women who were contemplating abortion. Kind of this transgender and gender identity dysphoria was becoming really, really common. And these are the same girls who, might I add, are pregnant and are considering having abortions. But these are the same people who have also had multiple sexual partners and are very confused about what love is and what the purpose of their bodies are. And so we have to see that this issue of same-sex attraction, abortion, and contraception are all directly related. When you take babies out of sex, and then because of that, you're able to take sex outside of marriage because you no longer have that baby that's as common when you're sexually involved. Well, then what happens is then it's the woman and the individual who suffers understanding the purpose of their sexuality and the baby who's left vulnerable to abortion. See, this confused sexuality all relates to one another when we don't understand its purpose. And so when we use kind of this claim of, people are just homophobic and we need to live and let live, actually, that's not giving the honest truth in the path to freedom and healing to even the girls who are experiencing, a crisis pregnancy. We need to give better help than that. And so that's one of the perspectives, Michael, I come from, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
It's funny you mentioned that today because I was just speaking with a client about this earlier. In therapy, sometimes our job as therapists, Timmery, is to accompany people as they try to explore and understand their own life path. So in other words, someone as an adult doesn't come to therapy to be told what to do. They're really looking for a guide as they seek to understand their path better. And I hold the perspective of a Catholic moral position. So in therapy, I try to ask questions that help clients think of things from that framework, some sort of Socratic questioning process. So what's interesting is for some clients who are particularly tempted to give into the world's definition of gender identity and sexuality, they might, for instance, have same-sex attraction but want to call themselves gay and begin to go live that lifestyle, but feel a little bit of a conflict because of their conscience and their morals. One question I asked a client recently was, how do you define sex? What does the act of sex even mean? And this is where I think liberal ideology sometimes really edges us out in the culture war. They try to redefine terms to help create confusion and thus redefine reality. And this client struggled like you wouldn't believe to even articulate an actual definition for sexual intercourse. And that's because the word itself is completely muddled and muddied, and it means nothing anymore. It's what sort of feels good to you between two people and their bodies if they kind of touch each other and they want to. It doesn't make any sense. We need to get back to reality. What is sex? And if you can define it, then you can begin from a point of reality to see where your body falls in line with that biological purpose and how you can begin to align yourself to moral reality that should be, as Catholics we believe, in line with biological reality. And this is the path towards inner harmony because your bodily and spiritual realities are in alignment with one another.
What's interesting about what you said is you were mentioning this client who kind of commented that, sex is, in trying to define it, maybe something that sort of feels good. And I noticed, especially working among young women who have experienced sexual abuse or maybe have been overly sexually active, might be bisexual and so forth, they often speak of feeling numb, that they no longer feel anything when they're engaging in sexual intimacy. There's no love, there's no passion, there's nothing special that's there. It's kind of just something that they start to do on instinct. And I've looked in the faces of these girls who are saying, how do I get that back? That desire and meaning of love that is written into sexual intimacy. And so this is why the truth about speaking about what sex has a purpose for, that it's only meant to work between a man and a woman. And we could get into, the physical harms of it, but we're talking even just about the harms to the heart that are so fundamental in a culture of such brokenness. But we haven't even touched, Michael, on kind of some of the links between same-sex attraction and gender identity disorder and how these also fuel insecurities with regard to sexuality as well.
And the insecurity is felt very tangibly by the person suffering it. From the outside, we often have these champions, like certain Instagram posts or social media posts on behalf of what they would call like straight allies or advocates. And I'm sorry, I don't have the time to listen to you without the experience also tell me what is the suffering of the individual that you've also witnessed. Because I've witnessed firsthand that suffering, and clients need and deserve to be able to have someone guide them according to their conscience in line with moral reality.
Coming up, we'll be asking the question, what is unconditional love? That's Michael Gasparo from Healing and Peace Catholic Therapy Services. Find them at healingandpeace.com. We'll be right back with Michael Gasparo.
We're talking about what you're thinking about. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
The Relevant Radio studio line is sponsored by Catholic Order of Foresters. Employment opportunities to become an agent or information about their flexible premium life insurance plans are available at relevantradio.com/Forester. Joining me today is Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparo from Healing and Peace Catholic Ministries. Find them at healingandpeace.com. Michael, listen, we've been talking about this topic surrounding homophobia, transphobia, and so forth. And I want to change the conversation a little bit. And here's how I want to change it. We often speak within the teaching of the Catholic Church about people who are living contrary lifestyles, whether maybe it's someone who's living with their boyfriend, maybe it's someone who's living out a same-sex lifestyle, maybe it's someone who's just, 35 years old, not working, and kind of just living a very mundane life, and maybe their parents are disappointed in them. I want to talk about what is unconditional love, and also how can parents work to accept their adult children who they maybe disagree with, but still love them while not approving a certain type of lifestyle.
Yeah, this comes up a lot in therapy, which I think is a good thing to point out. I love working with parents who are struggling with this issue because it's oftentimes parents who are well-intended who have fear that lovingly staying engaged with their children whom they disagree with will lead towards approving indirectly their behavior. And while it's certainly a complicated question to answer, I think it's one that often should be engaged more readily instead of avoided through fear. So that's one thing I really love talking to parents about. So particularly one example, like we've been talking about same-sex attraction. It's very common for parents to come to our Healing and Peace Catholic Therapy Ministries wanting counseling for dealing with adult children who have left the church and are engaging in a homosexual lifestyle. And one of the fears is if I engage with my son or daughter and I have a conversation with them or go to dinner with them, that I'm approving of their behavior. But one good starting place I would encourage people is to look to the Catechism. The Catechism of the Church in 1993 came and said there's a strong distinction between approval of homosexual behaviors and acceptance of homosexual persons. So one thing we can do as Catholics is seek the Holy Spirit's guidance to discern how can I accept with compassion, respect, and sensitivity this child of mine and still clearly not approve necessarily of all of their choices. And sometimes parents have a struggle even starting that. So we want to encourage them. If they need help, they can reach out for counseling services. But start the process. Start asking those difficult questions. Don't just avoid it through fear, is what I would start to say, first of all.
And this is interesting because having had a number of family members and friends who have experienced same-sex attraction over the years and chosen to live a gay lifestyle, because I always emphasize, you can experience same-sex attraction. The attraction itself is not a sin. It's when we choose to live it out. And so even then, we can still love people no matter where they're at, but there's a difference between approval of an action and approval of a person. Now, I do find it interesting, especially when parents struggle with this for their children, because I understand not wanting to show approval of an action, but at a certain point, you also have to evaluate, well, who are you worried about seeing your approval? Are you worried about your child seeing the approval of your love? Or are you worried about someone else thinking that you're approving the lifestyle? And sometimes I think we overthink what others and their perception of the situation is. When I think a real context that is a little more challenging is, for example, maybe when young children are involved and we have to explain awkward and difficult situations that little kids just aren't always quite ready to understand. But I have to tell you, I grew up in an environment where there were some awkward conversations that had to be answered and explained. One of my earliest childhood memories is sitting underneath my grandmother's kitchen table. And all of a sudden, I remember popping out from underneath the table and looking at an older family member of mine and saying, I love your nail polish. Can you paint my nails too? This family member was a man. And I remember everyone at the table kind of awkwardly giggling, and here I am sitting painting my nails with this family member. And I remember it wasn't until later on, we're driving in the car and I'm admiring my beautiful new metallic-y silver nail polish that I kind of all of a sudden looked at my mom and had one of those moments like, why was he wearing nail polish? Like, that was really cool. We got to paint our nails. but something was clearly up. And I don't remember what my mom said to me that day, and I have gone back and asked her, but I can tell you, whatever she said wasn't complicated. It didn't fuel hatred, it didn't fuel animosity, and it didn't fuel any sort of discord. That's how simple the memory was. And so I bring that up because, sure, I don't remember what was said, but I grew up loving my family members, and they always knew where our family stood on these various topics. And so, sure, I've had friends and family start to engage in battle on social media when I post or talk about something, but when I see them in person, they're totally cordial and nice, and we enjoy our time together. And so I think that this is also a kind of an experience that you yourself have had. We kind of overcomplicate the situation.
Yeah, and also remember, parents need to think about two other things too. One being, if you don't have your children in your sphere of influence to love them, you don't have them in your sphere of influence to offer guidance either. So while it's clean in theory to just cut off communication, because that's in theory for some people the loving thing to do because they feel as though they're approving someone's behavior, if you have no communication or relationship with someone, how do you expect to influence them? And two, remember the example of Jesus. He didn't wait for the woman at the well to have a perfect life before he sat and talked with her. He talked with her in the midst of her discord.
Amen.
And he offered this example over and over again. I'm coming to your house today, he said to Zacchaeus. He didn't say, figure your stuff out, leave this whole tax collector nonsense behind, and then I'll come over for dinner. Yeah, so we got to remember that we can follow that example of Jesus and trust that if we err on the side of mercy, in terms of connecting lovingly with people, even if we disagree with them or disapprove, I'd rather err on the side of mercy than judgment, personally.
I agree with you. And I think that there are certain circumstances that become more difficult. For example, maybe your friend or adult child is choosing to go through a quote-unquote same-sex marriage. Well, you can love them. You can spend time with them. Maybe you even go so far, and I think this is important, to respect the person that they are in a friendship, and unfortunately more than that with. But you don't have to go to the wedding, and I get that that's difficult. I get that that's painful. But if you are showing that they are, like you said, Michael, in your sphere of love, then you have the ability to influence them. And I think that you just really hit the nail on the head, because it's something that I need to remember too. I can't go around trying to influence people who I have not showed that I care about. You know, I'm just kind of, I think of the words of St. Paul when he talks about being a noisy gong. Like, you can have faith, but if you're just a noisy gong, not showing that faith and love, if you don't have love, what's the purpose? It's almost like just be quiet, or else you're just gonging about.
Well, and remember too that our belief as Catholics is that certain desires are disordered, and often disordered desires come from brokenness. And so while we don't fully understand the extent and the breadth of somebody's brokenness that might have led to whatever lifestyle they're living, whatever sin they're participating in, that should help us to have compassion. Similarly, like, I have some list, like a mile long sometimes, of the habitual sins I'm struggling with. That's why I keep going to confession. I struggle. I'm a sinner in need of God's mercy. And what do? I hope my friends look at me with compassion and say, Michael, even in your struggle, I still love you. I still am here with you to journey alongside of you as you strive to depend on God's grace more and to grow in holiness. And if my friends just were like, hey, get back to me when you're done figuring this out, then I wouldn't have accompaniment of the brothers in Christ that I have on this journey. So I think we can mirror that in our friends and our relationships, especially when we try to accept that we need that in our own life as well.
I'm finishing up reading the book, The Way of Perfection by St. Teresa of Avila right now. And as I was reading this morning, she was talking a lot about kind of when we start to feel kind of this guilt, remorse, and sorrow. And she was talking about temptation, essentially, and how when something's a temptation, it's going to make us feel yucky and degraded and belittled and just totally disgusted with ourselves. But when we really are in faith, kind of convicting our hearts and looking at our consciences, there's joy, because I see, okay, I'm committing this sin, but look at the virtue that I'm called to, and I joyfully choose to chase after that virtue. There should be peace and healing and joy in our journey, not just kind of this constant darkness. If there's that darkness there, we are being tempted so desperately by the evil one in those moments. And so it's a spiritual battle. If we're not seeing a light in the midst of the darkness, these are great moments to seek out reconciliation, to seek out spiritual guidance, to help us work through what am I missing that is not allowing me to truly embrace the spiritual joy that is being given to me by our Lord Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit.
And that's great to remember, especially after you sin, because that's when we're most tempted to despair, is in the midst of our failure. That's the 1-2 punch from the devil, is to say, not only did you mess up, but you can't get up again. And the grace of Jesus Christ says, no matter how many times you fall, just keep getting up. And his hand is there outstretched over and over again. Should we only reach even a little bit towards it? It's like the distance we have to go versus the distance he'll travel to meet us there is immeasurable. And that's what we have to remember in the midst of that despair, like you said. And the joy that we feel from that leads us towards that chasing of the virtues, like you mentioned. And that's what's great about one thing we highlight in therapy is we try not to tell people just don't do this. We say, what can you do? Instead of just telling people don't do fill in the blank, we say do this. What virtues, like you said, counter the vices you're struggling with? And that's a great perspective you share in that regard.
Michael, I know we have just a little more time with you, and if you're just joining us, you're listening to Trending with Timmerie. Coming up, I want to talk about some great news that we're hearing about Planned Parenthood as they've kind of illegally acquired some funding during the quarantine virus, and also some comments about Norma Mccorvey in the midst of this battle that we're seeing as a new documentary is coming out about Jane Roe, Norma McCorvey's Jane Roe of Roe versus Wade, and the truth of her story. Michael, I want to get your comments, though. I'm hearing from a lot of people who are really struggling during this quarantine, or maybe during a holiday, or just in general, feeling extremely single. I would love to get your thoughts on this, because I have to tell you, I myself, and I know you as well, have kind of lived out those single years for longer periods of time than we would have liked. And I know you and I both found at the heart of better understanding who we are and becoming better human beings, we directed ourselves towards service as part of the antidote to kind of allowing our lives to be defined by that status. Could you speak a little bit to finding joy in the midst of service when you're feeling kind of single and alone?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is beautiful words I heard from Bishop Robert Barron, who's out here in Los Angeles in Word on Fire Ministries, which does a lot of great work, which I'm sure your listeners are familiar with. And he said to a group of us young adults out here in Los Angeles a few years ago, your life is not about you. And that, at the time, felt a bit harsh. But ironically, even though he was telling my life wasn't about me, all of a sudden my life became less stressful, because it wasn't all about me. And my vocation then wasn't all about me either. It was about how I could be a bigger part or play my role in God's story, what Bishop Barron calls the theodrama. And as a single person, I have a role in the theodrama. I, today, on this day in 2020, have a role in that story of God's plan for the world, whether or not I'm married. And as Pope Francis said, vocation is today. It's not just in the future somewhere. And so that's what helps me at times when I struggle with this, because I'm single by choice, but I'm 33 years old. I've been single for quite a while now. And sometimes it can be hard not to feel like I have a more permanent sense of my vocation, either as a married person or as a consecrated life of some kind. And so I try to remember my vocation doesn't start then. It starts now. And every day I have a mission and a purpose and a calling as a part of that role in God's story. And if I can focus on that each day, that helps combat the temptation towards despair. Like, I'll be happy when I meet that person, or I'll be happy when this happens in the future.
I'll be happy when I get that job. I'll be happy when I finish this degree. I'll be happy when I have this child. And, it's always, we're looking for happiness in the next thing that we achieve. And I think that this is why this is relevant, not just to maybe someone who's feeling lonely during, the coronavirus and feeling really single. I think that what really helped transform things for me, I so desperately, or I shouldn't say desperately, I longed to be married and I think a lot of people long for that mission mission of another person, long for the mission of having a family. And what we need to come to understand is that longing to others, like Bishop Barron said, your life isn't about you. Sometimes we think that it's only done in a specific type of relationship, but that longing for a mission, that longing for service can be lived out day in and day out, no matter your circumstances. I have been blessed to be surrounded by some incredible women who have been widowed at a very young age, and I have seen them literally transform the community by the love and sacrifice that they have been willing to give in the community by showing my life is not my own. I am called to service. I am called to love. I am called to give my motherhood, even if not biologically, but spiritually in the culture.
Yeah, and I think it's also really important to remember that control is a little bit of an illusion. Just as the person who got married at a young age and was widowed at a young age found out, our plans that we have often don't turn out the way we think they will. And so being open to the surprise of our role in God's story can lead to a beautiful and thrilling adventure if we let it.
No, I'm thinking we've been rewatching Downton Abbey recently, and I think about Mary Crawley and how she ends up losing her husband early on in the show in the first couple of seasons, and you kind of see an ugly version of Mary come out throughout Downton Abbey, and she starts to kind of regain herself as she meets someone else, but that shouldn't be your and my story. That might be the story of a secular culture, but our story is that we know that we are called to goodness and sacrificial love, no matter the circumstances, the pain, the joy, whatever it may be that you and I are surrounded by on a day-to-day basis that changes every single day.
Yeah, and Jesus said, though, he wants us to have life and to have it abundantly. And St. Irenaeus famously said, the glory of God is man fully alive. So don't wait to be fully alive until someday in the future when you think your vocation is finally where it should be. How about you strive to find how God is asking you to be fully alive today, and then that will make momentum towards your long-term vocation even more clear, possibly in the process.
That is Michael Gasparo. You can find him at healingandpeace.com. He'll be back with us next Wednesday. We'll be right back here on Trending with Timmery.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Starting this Thursday, the 20th, it's the Feast of the Ascension, and Father Rocky will lead a Marian Pentecost Novena to help you prepare for Pentecost Sunday and to pray daily for the end to the pandemic so that all churches can open for everyone. Sign up to receive Father Rocky's daily novena reflections, and we'll also send you a free copy of his new book, Mary at the Crossroads of History. In this limited edition book, you'll learn how Our Lady is always present and working in our lives, especially when we find ourselves at a crossroads. Sign up for Father Rocky's daily novena reflection and your free ebook at relevantradio.com or right now on the Relevant Radio app. I want to share with you a little bit of good news. It's kind of one of those moments where I just really appreciated seeing that there's going to be some justice done. I'm sure you followed during this coronavirus stimulus packages that have passed through various bills that have passed. We saw the Small Business Administration end up implementing a paycheck protection program. Now, the great news that we received, I think over a month ago, was that Planned Parenthood would not qualify for this money. They're too large of an organization, and they have over $500 million in assets and already receive too much government funding, and so they are not eligible, and that was made very clear early on. But what slipped between the cracks is that apparently over 37 Planned Parenthood facilities have now received a combined total of $80 million. Now, this upsets me because Planned Parenthood facilities in my own backyard here in Southern California, facilities that we have spent countless years praying in front of, sidewalk counseling, and helping women to leave the abortion clinics, where we're also not really allowed to pray in front of the abortion clinics. One group, for example, Planned Parenthood of Orange and San Bernardino, where I've been in front of all of their clinics here in these areas, just combined received $7.5 million from the Small Business Administration for the Paycheck Protection Program. So Senator Marco Rubio and others are saying this isn't okay. Guess what? They have to give the money back. Who knows how they got it? Who knows if they clearly knew that they weren't eligible and qualified themselves in some way, or if someone was just kind of passing this under the radar and allowing it to happen. But there is going to be justice served in this situation. Praise the Lord. I hope Planned Parenthood abortion facilities have to close over this, because here you are opening your doors when you shouldn't be open, and you're hurting women, and now you're taking money from other organizations and companies that desperately need it to put food on their tables, and you're performing services that are not necessary when our economy is shut down. So praise the Lord. I think justice is going to be served in this circumstance. Now, on another note, I want to share with you about a woman that you may have not really heard much about. Her name is Norma Mccorvey, and that's the real name of Jane Roe from the Supreme Court case Roe versus Wade that legalized abortion in 1973. At the time, Norma Mccorvey, known as Jane Roe, was seeking an abortion. By the way, if you didn't know this, she never obtained the abortion, and she placed her precious child for adoption. Now, Norma Mccorvey, who was used as the face of the pro-abortion movement in this circumstance, ended up converting to becoming an evangelical in the mid-1990s, and toward the end of the 1990s, ended up converting to Catholicism. Now, there's a smear piece being done on this beloved woman's name, this woman who, although may have been at the forefront of participating in helping to legalize abortion, became an incredible pro-life advocate. Now, FX is doing a documentary, and in the documentary's preview, they claim that on her deathbed, because she died just a few years, within the last few years, she claims that the pro-life movement used her and paid her off, and that she really wasn't pro-life. This is an absolute lie, and I am disgusted to see this woman who saw the horror that she went through, who was used by the pro-abortion movement, and who had, you guys, a truly incredible conversion. I am just disgusted that they are using her now to push their agenda. We've been talking about this show, Mrs. America, on Hulu, about Phyllis Schlafly, who was a clear pro-life advocate, and they've been smearing her name. Now is Norma Mccorvey, who participated in helping to legalize abortion, but who is clearly converted to Catholicism and who experienced mental illness, substance abuse, claims she experienced sex abuse, was even in government institutions as a child. This woman, they're using her name wrongly and using a false claim that she was being manipulated by the pro-life movement, when in fact, Norma Mccorvey spent so much of her time freely giving to help change what she saw happening in the culture. And I personally got to talk to Norma Mccorvey in a number of circumstances, and she shared that she faced extreme pain for what she had participated in, but she was an incredible pro-life advocate.